there, and welcome back to How to Sell Your Home Staging Business, a Real Women, Real Business podcast mini-series for home stagers who are thinking about what it could like to eventually sell their business, or at least make sure that they have some options in order before that day comes. I am your host, Shauna Lynn Simon, and I have been walking you through over the last few episodes many different elements of selling your home staging business. We've talked about exit readiness, sellability, numbers, valuation, inventory systems and operations, team members, and transferability. And we've done this through the lens of what a buyer is going to be looking at in your business. And as we've identified, it's not all that different sometimes to selling a house. And of course, as home stagers, we know a whole lot about that. But today I want to talk about what happens once the business actually starts to move forward with a sale. So specifically, I want to talk about through what like a typical deal flow actually looks like. So what is step one? What is step two? When are you sharing different parts of the information? And just like any real estate transaction, there is actually a standard process that we're going to follow here. And it's important to follow it because it helps to protect the integrity of the deal, as well as the seller and the buyer's time. We've only got so much time in a day, so much energy, so many reserves that we can draw upon. We want to make sure that we are having the right conversations at the right time and not sharing too much too soon and overexhausting ourselves. So once you've prepared the business for sale, okay, it's time to sell it. Let's get it listed and up and ready to go. So we're going to cover how the process works and what that flow of information looks like, and also how brokers and other professionals fit into the process. So here is what the general order of things looks like. This is not 100% set in stone, but this is a relatively standard deal process for any small business sale. It starts off with a teaser or a listing, and I will get into what each of these actually looks like in just a moment. So it starts off with a teaser or a listing, then we move to an NDA or non-disclosure agreement, then we move to a prospectus or a SIM package, then we have a buyer conversation or 2 or 3, then we have our LOI, next is your due diligence, then we're closing and the transition takes place. And I'm going to get into what each of these actually means, what all these letters stand for as well. But one thing I want you to understand first is that real life is not always perfectly linear. There may be a little bit of back and forth. There may be a second, third, fourth, even fifth buyer call before an LOI takes place. There may be some light qualifications before the NDA. In fact, I strongly recommend that there is. Some brokers or intermediaries may structure things just slightly different from this. But overall, the principles are the same. The information that's going to be shared with potential buyers gets shared in layers. We're not going to lead with like, here's everything you need to know about my business. You're going to start with enough information to create that initial interest. Then as the buyer becomes more serious and more qualified, then they get access to more detailed information. Understanding how this flow works is going to matter because it's going to help to protect your confidentiality, your leverage, your relationships, and your energy. One of the fears I often hear from clients is that they're afraid that business is going to drop once they've listed their business for sale. But if you follow this process, your identity is protected to avoid exactly that from happening. Because the whole goal is that we are selling your buyers a fully operational and thriving business. And if we are dropping in the sales because we're losing client interest and there's uncertainty around the future of our business, that's going to impact how the sale actually falls through. So we want to make sure that we're following this process. So let's start with step one. This is your teaser and or listing. Sometimes you're doing both, sometimes you're doing one or the other. So the first stage, this is the very first step that we're doing. And this is essentially a high level introduction to the opportunity of buying your business for sale. If it's a public listing, it means that it might be listed on some sort of business for sale platform. Sometimes it is listed on the MLS. Otherwise, there are some other platforms that do exist specifically for people who are looking to purchase a business. So similar to a marketplace like Facebook, these are directories that usually require a payment and are a part of the selling process to list on at least a couple of these directories. Now, if it's a private process, you're not going to list on these public directories, and instead you're going to have this teaser that gets quietly sent out to some selected potential buyers that you've identified or someone has identified may be interested in purchasing your business. Either way, This is not the place to share every single detail. And in fact, regardless of whether it is a public or a private listing, you usually are going to protect your company's identity. Your company name is usually not a part of this. There are some exceptions to this, of course, and it depends on what you've got laid out and the transparency that you have provided to your team, to your clients. But again, if we want to protect the revenue engine that is coming into that business, then likely we're going to keep the name of the company confidential for the time being. So the purpose of the teaser or listing is simply to help the right buyer to say, oh, like this might actually be worth learning a little bit more about. Now, for a staging business, a teaser or your listing may include some things such as the general location or market service area of your business, the type of staging business. So what are your general service offerings? Are they vacants, occupied, holiday design? Are they strictly consultations? Do you have your own inventory? Do you have a full service inventory model? That sort of thing. It's also going to have maybe a high level revenue or cash flow summary. This is usually just saying, average annual revenue of approximately, and it gives a ballpark number in there. It might have a bit of a broad overview of assets included, something about, if you've got a truck or a vehicle or a warehouse or a certain amount of inventory. So it may mention things like a warehouse that actually comes with it, the team, the reputation, the client base, and any growth opportunities potentially. We'll talk about more on that in a moment. Sometimes it will also include the SDE or your seller's discretionary earnings and what you've calculated that to be. If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, please go back to part 3 of the mini series. That will get into it a little bit deeper and you'll understand a little bit more. And in fact, if you haven't listened to any of the previous episodes, this is part 6 that we're talking about here. Go back and make sure that you've caught the other 5 so that everything that we're covering today will make sense. Now, usually the teaser does not list the sale price. And part of the reason for this is the teaser is an evergreen item that's being sent out, and you might choose to adjust that list price after you've had it listed for a little bit of time. Sometimes you might want to keep the specific list price confidential just until the next stage period. So you might not actually share the list price even on any sort of public listings. So the public listings, though, some of the sites actually require that you do put in a list price. But usually the teaser does not have that because, again, this is an evergreen document that you're going to send out to people. And if you do want to make any updates, they're not going to be able to see it as a live update. Here's what we do not include into the teaser. It usually doesn't include, again, the full business name. We're protecting your company's identity here. So if confidentiality matters, then we're not providing your company name. But it also usually doesn't include things like client lists, detailed financials, or anything that could expose the business unnecessarily. So think of the teaser as the front door. Gives buyers just enough to decide whether or not they want to knock. So this is sort of that curb appeal a little bit. That's about it. Step 2. This is where we have our initial inquiry and light qualification. So once someone responds to the teaser or the listing that's out there, there's usually some sort of qualification that comes in. This might be handled by you personally. More often, it's handled by a broker or an intermediary. If you're trying to protect your business identity and maintain confidentiality, then you're going to need to enlist the services of someone else to act on your behalf. And we'll cover more on that in a little bit as well. So at this stage, at step 2, where they've just reached out to us and they said, like, hey, I'm a little bit interested. We want to try to understand whether this person is worth moving forward with to another step. So you might want to know things like, why are they interested in your business? Do they understand home staging or have any experience in it? Are they looking to operate the business themselves? Are they already in the industry somehow? Do they have access to funds? And this is pretty big, and it's common to ask this at this stage if they have a funding plan. You might want to understand what their timeline is looking like. If this is a fit, how quickly are you prepared to move forward with this? And are they a serious buyer, or are they just browsing? Are they just curious? It does not need to be an interrogation, so I don't recommend sending them a full list of all of these questions necessarily. We simply want to have a bit of a filter. So while answers to all of these questions would be great, I suggest picking the 3 to 4 questions that are the highest priority to you and kind of weave them into the conversation before sending any further details. Now, again, this is likely not going to be you who is handling these conversations, but it's a good idea to discuss with your broker or your intermediary if there are specific things that you want to make sure that they have in terms of pre-qualification. Usually they already have this well set up, but if there's anything that's especially important to you, like if you're saying, listen, if they can't close this deal within 3 months of whenever they show their interest, then I'm not interested in dealing with them. If you've got a really tight timeline, these are things that are going to be important to you. Now, the key point here is that I'm interested, when someone's putting their hand up like this, is not the same as saying I'm actually qualified. And so before you start sharing any deeper information, we want to know a little bit about who we're dealing with. And the next step after this, step number 3, is the NDA. So if the buyer seems like someone worth continuing with, we're going to send them now the NDA. It stands for a non-disclosure agreement. And this is sort of that confidentiality gate. So once a buyer signs the NDA, you can begin sharing more meaningful information about the business. But keep in mind, we're also going to keep learning about the buyer as well. This is where they may be a bit more willing to share a little bit about what they're experiencing and what they're looking for in the deal. Now, an NDA still does not mean that you're going to send them everything. It means that the conversation has simply moved into a more serious and a more protected stage of the deal. And this is especially important in home staging because so much of the value of your business is very relationship based. Your agents, your clients, your team, your vendors, your local reputation, your competitors, your market presence. You do not want sensitive information floating around before you're actually ready to share it. So the NDA is one of the tools that protects that information. So once both parties, you're both going to sign this non-disclosure agreement. Once that is signed, the buyer is going to receive, this is step 4, is going to receive your prospectus or your CIM. CIM is spelled CIM, and it stands for Confidential Information Memorandum or Materials. Depending on who you're talking to, they're going to use a different word for the M in CIM, but essentially this is the confidential package. You might also hear it called a deal package or a business summary or a prospectus. Most commonly in home staging business deals, we're calling it a prospectus. So that's the name I'm going to mostly refer to going forward. The name, of course, is less important though than the actual purpose of it. This is the document that gives the buyers a fuller picture of the business. And it usually explains a bit more about what the business is, how it operates, what makes it valuable, and why it may be a good opportunity. This is the next step for them to be able to say, this is something I really am interested in and I want to take it to the next level. So similar to kind of going back a couple of times to view a property for sale, but in this case, we're seeing like you go back to the property a second time, you might see some things you didn't notice the first time, or the seller might also disclose a couple of extra things that they might think will help to sweeten the deal a little bit. But it's a bit more nuanced when we're buying a business, and there's a few more layers to this. So for a staging business, that prospectus or that CIM package, that might include, again, your business overview, including the identity of your company. It's going to include your services offered, your revenue streams. What is your top producing revenue stream? What's secondary to that? So you might give a little bit of a breakdown of the mix. Like my vacant staging brings in 70% of the revenue versus our consults, which are about 10%, et cetera. It might have your financial summaries. Sorry, I shouldn't say might. It will have your financial summaries. What most buyers are usually looking for at this stage is 2 to 3 years of your P&L or purchase and loss statements. They might also ask for what's called a trailing 12 months, which means a monthly P&L over the last 12 months, regardless of what your fiscal year is. In this prospectus, you're also going to identify what assets are included in the sale. You'll give a bit of a bigger inventory overview. So you might have said in the teaser that you have enough inventory for, say, 50 properties. But in this inventory overview, you might be saying, no, 50% of the inventory has been purchased within the last 3 years. You might give a bit of a better mix of how many sofas you have, or a general overview of some of the pictures, of portfolio to see some of the items as well. Because keep in mind, I should probably kind of go back to this. In the beginning, when we're putting out that teaser or that listing, one thing I tell my clients is I do not recommend using any photos of anything that can actually be traced back to your company. Remember, in today's technology, it's really easy to do an image search. So if someone wants to find out the identity of your company, they pop that image into Google and boom, it pops up exactly where that image is posted, whether it's on your website or your social media feed. So if we're going to be putting any images into that listing, I do not recommend using one that is already associated publicly with your business. So either it's a photo that you've just never shared publicly, which I'll be honest, in the experience of most of my clients, they can't say for certain that a photo has not been used publicly. So more often what we end up doing is we use a photo that I provide instead that has come out of one of my portfolios or something that is not intended to be indicative of the business, but it's just intended to be a bit of an attention grabber, essentially. Okay, so we're going to give a bit of an inventory overview in this prospectus. Again, there might be some photos, there might be a little bit more of a breakdown of what this looks like. We're going to also talk about our team or contractor structure. So normally in the teaser or the listing, we're going to say how many full-time or part-time people we have. We might indicate that we have an operations manager or something, but here we're going to get a little bit more detailed. We might even talk about what their individual salaries are. We're not usually giving names at this point, but we might give a little bit more detail about roles and responsibilities, how many people are part-time versus full-time, and what their overall payroll looks like. You're going to also include in your prospectus your market positioning. So what part of the market do you hold? What sets you apart? What makes you awesome? You'll also maybe talk about some client or referral sources, not necessarily specific names, but just identifying where a lot of your business comes from. You'll talk about your systems and operations. Normally, you're going to list what we call a tech stack in this, which is identifying the different software programs that you use to keep your business running. This is not an entire SOP binder at this stage. It's just a general overview of what systems and processes are in place so they can see that things are not just living in your head. For example, do you have an inventory software program? Do you have an invoicing system? The next thing that you're going to include is actually bigger than I think a lot of people give it credit for, and that is growth opportunities. Listen, this is your business, and I am sure you have identified some opportunities to grow, but you may not be in a position or have the desire to pursue them. But you've identified that there are ways that you could grow, whether it's adding another warehouse in a neighboring city and expanding your operations pretty easily that way. Maybe it's about an untapped market for a particular service. Maybe you see Airbnbs are popping up everywhere and you believe that that's a market that hasn't been really well tapped into in your area. Whatever it looks like, this is where you want to talk about what some of the growth opportunities are that you are seeing in your area. And then the last thing you want to make sure is in that prospectus is an outline of what you are offering in terms of transition support. So this is where all that work from the previous episodes that we've talked about, this is where all that work's starting to show up now, right? We've talked about the importance of your numbers and your financials, your inventory and how it fits in, your systems and operations, your team and contractor relationships, and your positioning. And the prospectus helps the buyer to understand this business as an opportunity without giving them every single raw document in the business. It is more detailed than the teaser, but it's still not the same as full due diligence. You're going to still hold some things back here, like things like buyer lists, perhaps more detailed financials, your client names, intricate details of your systems and operations. They might ask for things like tax returns at this stage, and you can say, no, that's a due diligence item. It's up to you in terms of your comfort level in what to provide now versus later. Okay, so step 5 now. This is the buyer conversation. So after they've reviewed the prospectus, they're usually going to want to have a conversation, right? No one's buying a business sight unseen, essentially. And sometimes, and actually quite often, there may be more than one conversation. This might take a few conversations to get us to the next step in the process. Now, the purpose here is to discuss the business, answer any appropriate questions they have, and determine whether or not there's enough alignment between both of you in order to move forward. This is also where the buyer may want to understand things like, how involved are you as the owner? What might this transition actually look like? What makes the business work? What makes it strong? What are the biggest opportunities? What are the biggest risks that you're seeing? How does the inventory support the revenue structure? How do clients and agents typically come in? What does that actual client journey look like? How does the team or contractor structure work? And this is an important conversation to have, but it does still need some boundaries. Remember, you're not in due diligence yet, so you're not handing over every file, but you are helping them understand the business well enough to decide whether or not they want to make an offer. So step 6 is what we call an LOI. So if the buyer is saying, yes, I want to move forward, an LOI is sort of like a precursor to the official agreement. This is where we're going to start talking terms. So LOI stands for letter of intent. So this is going to be where we're going to outline the proposed deal framework. It's usually not the final purchase agreement, but it is intended to represent what the final purchase agreement might look like. So it outlines the major terms so that both sides can actually decide whether it makes sense to continue on. So your LOI, usually written up by the buyer, but with some of the seller, with your input, because you're telling them essentially, here's what I'm selling, here's what transition support is going to look like and everything else. And they're saying, this is what we want. This is the price that we're going to offer to pay you. And this is what we want. And that price they're offering might be your full list price, Rarely is it higher than your list price, but if there are multiple people that are interested, you never know. And sometimes it'll also be lower than your list price. It's also going to have your payment structure included in there as well. So this is where they're going to say if they're going to be paying cash, if they're going to be financing it, whether or not they're going to be needing a seller note. They're also going to talk about in here what they expect to be included in the sale, whether or not inventory is included in that, whether it is an asset sale or a share sale. They're going to talk about the deposit and payment timing. And again, you've likely outlined these items to them already of what your expectations are for a deposit and for the final payment timing. But this is where you're negotiating those terms a little bit. Keep in mind, if they are dealing with a bank for financing, that will be dictating some of those arrangements as well. So you may need to offer a little bit of flexibility in terms of those things, but it's up to you how comfortable you feel with that. It will also have what's called an exclusivity period. So here's the thing, you can only, I shouldn't say technically you can do this with more than one person, but generally for an LOI, you are only having one with one person at a time. So you're going to have this transition support, and these expectations are going to be outlined in there as well as a target closing date. Now, the LOI gets the big pieces onto paper before everyone goes deeper. And this is where I want sellers to understand something incredibly important here. Price is only one part of the deal. The terms that are coming up in here, those matter too. And it's just like, it's not like selling a house, right? Sometimes you don't accept the highest price offer. You accept the one that's not conditional on financing, or the one that gives you the closing date that you want. So before you list the business, it's really important to give some thought to what terms matter the most to you, because it doesn't always come down to the dollars. A deal with more cash at close may feel very different than a deal with seller financing, a seller note, or earnouts, or longer transition requirement. Now, I don't have the time in these podcast episodes to get into the details of what a seller note or seller financing looks like, what earnouts look like, what these transitions might look like in greater detail, but do know that this is something that we do cover in greater detail in our Sell Your Home Staging Business Bootcamp. Okay, so the LOI stage is where you start looking at the whole structure, not just what the headline number looks like. So they might, yes, just like anytime you get a proposal, you're probably going to scan to the price immediately, but then let's dig into the terms a little bit. So sometimes they might be offering you a lower price than what you were asking for, but the terms are more appealing to you. Okay, so then step 7 is where we get into the due diligence part of things. So this is, once the LOI has been signed, the buyer usually moves into due diligence. And as I mentioned, we are giving an exclusivity to a particular buyer during the due diligence time. Now, how long that is up to you and that buyer. It's usually anywhere from 30 to 90 days. It depends on the size of the business, the deal agreements that you have in place, but you'll want to understand that you do have a time in place. You can potentially offer an extension of those, but you'll want to do something that's realistic for both you and the buyer to work towards. So now this is where they're going to verify the information that they've been given. And we're going to put together essentially a full due diligence package for them. We're going to have a little bit of a file essentially for them where they're going to have things like more detailed financial records, including tax returns, inventory records, any lease details if you're leasing a vehicle or a warehouse. Those will be included in there, including any contracts and transferability arrangements that you've got outlined, any contracts that you have, whether they exist between you and someone else already, but you also might be showing them contracts that you have with your clients. This is where we might show them things like the software, the systems that are in place. Your team and contractor information gets a lot more detailed here. They'll want to understand what sort of insurance you have in place, what marketing assets you're utilizing, what your client concentration risk looks like. Now, they may have asked for client concentration in an earlier stage, but you wouldn't be given it in terms of specific names. You might just say like, oh, my top 5 clients make up X percentage of my revenue. Here, they might actually want to get into who is specifically your top 5 clients and what types of clients are they. You might also get into some of your vendor relationships here and even into some of the operational documents. Now, you're not training them to take over your business, but again, they're going to want to see some things behind the scenes. This is where the buyer is essentially saying, like, I need to confirm that this business is what I understand it to be. Is it actually on the inside looking the same way as it looks on the outside? They may even visit your warehouse or shadow you on a project. This is not uncommon. So now you might be wondering, okay, well, does this mean that I got to tell my team what's going on? And I won't go too far into detail on this, but generally you're not telling your team until you're actually close to selling. So depending on how long the due diligence process is, your team might not be aware of the sale when the buyer is meeting them, in which case you would likely introduce them as perhaps a consultant or even a new team member. I generally recommend try not to stretch the truth too much, because keeping in mind your team's going to need to work with this person after, and you want to ensure that you are maintaining some level of integrity for that, so it doesn't feel like you are being deceptive. However, you want to understand that there's a chance that this deal might not go through still. An LOI does not mean I am definitely buying your business. An LOI simply means I want to enter into due diligence and peek behind the curtain. And unfortunately, more deals fall apart during due diligence than not, which is why it's so important that you're prepared for the sale process so that due diligence goes nice and smoothly. Now, this can feel really intense during this process if you're not prepared. There's a lot of document requests. There may be some very detailed questions, things that you haven't always given a whole lot of thought to as you've been running the day-to-day. There may be a lot of follow-up conversations with different parties involved, such as accountants, lawyers, lenders, and other advisors. The more organized your information is, the smoother this stage tends to be. The more scattered things are, the more stressful it becomes. This is also where deals can slow down or even get renegotiated if something doesn't quite line up with what the buyer had expected. Now, I also want to be very, very clear one more time that due diligence does not guarantee a sale. At no point, usually for due diligence, you have not received any sort of financial deposit or anything that is binding that buyer to purchasing your company. However, if due diligence does go well, then we move on to step 8, which is the closing. And these are the final agreements, where those final agreements are completed and the deal moves toward that closing. So legal documents are signed, funds are moved, ownership transfers over according to whatever the deal structure is. And this is where your lawyer and your accountant are especially important. Your lawyer helps to get the legal documents, purchase agreement, closing requirements, non-compete or non-solicit terms, and other legal details organized. Every lawyer is going to be different depending on the complexity of the deal in terms of what the pricing for this is, but you do want to ensure that you are budgeting for this. This is something that usually you as the seller will be covering your lawyer, the buyer will be covering their lawyer. However, you may choose to split the legal fees as well, depending on the relationship that you have with them. Now, your accountant or tax advisor will also help you to understand the financial and tax implications once this deal goes through. Now, if a broker or intermediary is involved, and we'll get a little bit more into that in a moment, they may help to coordinate the communication and keep the process moving. However, your legal and tax professionals are there to protect you on the technical details. Your broker intermediary is meant to be more in an advisory type of role, and they might help to facilitate some of those conversations, like I said. Okay, so you've sold the business, you've gone through the closing date, the funds have been transferred, everyone is signed on the dotted line, we are good to go. The next and final step of this is step 9, which is the transition. So usually after closing, there is some form of transition support. You are essentially training your replacement. They're going to need to know how to replace you and step into your shoes. And despite the great job that you've done, of course, with documenting your processes, providing some training and support to them is going to help to ensure a smooth transition and protects your clients and relationships. You will usually make an announcement during this time as well, endorsing the new management, saying, I'm super excited as I move on to this next chapter, whatever that looks like. I'm super excited to introduce you to the person who's going to take this business from here and beyond, and they're going to do great things with it. And you really sing their praises on this, because hopefully you also believe that that's exactly what they're going to do. Now, transition support helps that buyer to step into the business with so much more confidence and be able to kind of hit the ground running. But it also protects the legacy of what you've built. And isn't that one of the main things? Like, yes, we want to make some money when we sell our business, but we also want to see the fruits of our labor continue on in a succession plan. And this is what that is. So this should be clearly defined, though, what your transition support is. How long does it last for? What's included? Is it by phone, email, Zoom? Is it in person? Likely you're going to have a mix of both, where you're going to have some heavier support at the beginning and it's going to taper off in the later days, and depend on how long your transition plan is for. And what happens if the buyer wants more support later? This is not uncommon, but if it's not included in the deal, then there's usually an additional fee for that. And it's a good thing to make sure that you have outlined ahead of time what that might look like. And what happens if they want to do that paid consulting? How does that actually work for you? Especially if you've got a seller note in place or earnouts in place, how might that work? So these details should all be discussed before closing so everyone understands the expectations. Now, one of the final points that I do want to get into is just a little bit about where brokers and professionals fit into this, because this is an area that can feel really confusing sometimes. And people often ask me, do I need to list my business with a broker? And the reality is, yes and no, depends. So depending on your situation, there may be several professionals that are actually involved in the sale process. A broker or an intermediary may help you prepare the business for market. They might help create the teaser or listing. They might screen inquiries, manage NDAs, share the prospectus, coordinate some buyer conversations, and support the process through the LOI and due diligence. Now you've got a lawyer, another professional is your lawyer that helps with those confidentiality agreements, the deal structure, purchase agreements, closing documents, and legal protection. If you've got an accountant or tax advisor, which I highly recommend, they're going to help with the financial presentation, any tax implications, potentially helping you to calculate your SDE, add backs, and deal structure, and what this sale may mean for you financially. And depending on the business, there may also be a lender, a landlord, an insurance advisor, bookkeeper, valuation professional, or other specialists that's being pulled in at different points. The key to understand is that you do not need to navigate every single piece alone, but you should also not hand the whole thing off and stop paying attention. Regardless of what professionals you have in place, you need to be a part of the process still. So even when you have good professionals involved, you need to understand this flow well enough to be able to make informed decisions each step of the way. And this is actually a big part of the work that I've been doing with home stagers who are exploring a sale. So from an education side, I help staging business owners to understand what is it they've built, what a buyer might actually care about. For example, some of the things that we've covered in this mini series, what needs to be clarified before buyer conversations happen, and how to move through the process with more confidence. As an intermediary myself, sometimes that also means helping a seller to prepare their business before going to market. This might include helping them to think through what should be included or excluded from the actual sale, what still needs to be cleaned up on their end before we can hit the market, and how are we going to present the opportunity clearly, as well as create that actual deal package for listings. So it might mean overseeing the listing, screening buyers, and facilitating NDAs. Sometimes it means helping a buyer on their end understand what they should be looking at before they purchase a home staging business. And in some cases, I'm also helping to connect potential buyers and sellers through my confidential buyer and seller database. Because in this industry, though, a traditional business sale process does not always fit neatly into one particular type of flow. A staging business is not just a generic small business. As we've covered a lot through this mini-series, there's inventory, there's client and agent relationships, there's owner involvement, there's warehouse and lease considerations, there's systems, team dynamics, vendor relationships, and a very specific operational rhythm that buyers need to understand. So yes, professionals absolutely matter in the process. You need the right legal, financial, and tax support, but you also need someone who understands the staging industry well enough to be able to help you through the practical business side of the sale. Because the better you understand the process, the better questions you can ask every step of the way. And the better questions that you ask, the less likely you are to feel rushed, confused, or pressured into decisions that you don't fully understand. Okay, so let's zoom out a little bit. So just to recap what we covered here, the information flow usually looks something like this. We've got a teaser or listing that gives high-level information. We've got the NDA that protects confidentiality before the deeper details are shared. The prospectus or SIM package gives a more complete picture of the business. The buyer conversation helps both sides to assess the fit. The LOI outlines the proposed deal. Your due diligence verifies the details. The closing finalizes the transaction, and transition transfers the knowledge and operating rhythm. That's the process in relatively plain language, as much as I could anyway. The reason why this all matters is actually really simple, because you don't want to share the wrong information at the wrong time. Too little information and buyers can't tell if they're actually interested, and they might just walk away because they're confused. Too much information too early, and you can potentially be exposing the business unnecessarily. I know it's really exciting when you have a buyer who's potentially interested, but it is really important to ensure that you're protecting your business every step of the way throughout this final process as well. The goal is to give buyers what they need at each stage so that the right people can keep moving forward and the wrong people can self-select and exit before you have shared too much. So let's recap this mini series for a moment, because we started with exit readiness and why you don't always get to pick your exit date. And we talked about what makes a staging business sellable. We talked about numbers, valuation, SDE, a term that probably most of you didn't even know before listening to these episodes, and why revenue alone does not tell the full story. We also talked about inventory. While inventory supports value, it is not the business itself. We talked about systems, team, and transferability. And today we walked through the deal flow from your teaser to closing and transition. Now, if you missed any of these episodes, please be sure to go back and catch them. You don't want to miss any of them because they're all incredibly important to the whole process here. All of this has been a really high level overview, and I really hope that it's helped to provide you with some clarity around the areas that you're going to want to think about before you begin your exit. And if this series has made you realize that there is more to selling a staging business than you originally thought, that's exactly why I created the Sell Your Staging Business Bootcamp. Inside this bootcamp, we go deeper into each of these areas through the lens of a home staging business and through the lens of what your buyers are going to be looking for. We talk about exit readiness and what needs to be prepared before you are in active sale conversations. We take a closer look at your numbers, your valuation, your SDE, your add backs, and the financial story that a buyer is going to be reading. We cover inventory, tangible assets, intangible assets, and how to position what you have built. We talk about systems, operations, team, contractors, and transferability. And we walk through how to package this business, what belongs in the teaser versus the prospectus, how to think about NDAs, buyer calls, LOIs, due diligence, negotiation levers, and transition support. And here's the best part. We provide the worksheets and the templates and checklists for all the things that you need to prepare and list your business for sale. And most importantly, as I've mentioned previously, this is all home staging business specific, because selling a home staging business has its own realities, from inventory and warehouses to project-based revenue, the ebbs and flows of the market, the agent relationships, your involvement as an owner and operator sometimes. Sometimes you're just the owner and overseeing things. Other times you're operating it. You've got your team and your contractor dynamics, your local reputation, and all of these pieces matter because they need to be understood before you are in the middle of the process. So the bootcamp is taught in live and small cohorts, and you're going to get the opportunity to actually review your business needs and your plans directly with me. That's why we keep these intentionally small. Now, if you're interested in learning more about bootcamp and when our next sessions start, please feel free to visit us at slsacademy.com/sell-your-biz. Now, just keep in mind, if you do want to get in on the next cohort, again, we do keep these intentionally small, so you're going to want to claim your seat before it sells out. And if you are still in the early stages and want a free place to start, don't forget, we've still got that Sell Ready guide, that ebook about is your business sellable. Go to slsacademy.com/sell-ready and use the code SELL100, sell100 at checkout. But if you are ready to go deeper, the bootcamp is where we're going to work through the practical pieces together, because you've worked too hard to build a business to leave its future to guesswork. You deserve to understand what you've built, what a buyer will need to see, and what steps you can take now to give yourself more options. And if you're interested in checking out the bootcamp, of course, don't forget to go to slsacademy.com/sell-your-biz, BIZ. I want to thank you for listening to this special podcast mini series. And I truly hope that you have managed to catch all the episodes in this. And I hope the biggest takeaway is this, that you do not need to be ready to sell in order to start preparing for your business. You just need to be willing to look at your business through a bit of a clearer lens, and doing so will help you to build a stronger and more profitable business now that is worth far more when it comes time to sell. So thank you again for joining me on this journey. I hope you have found it helpful. Feel free to reach out to us at slsacademy.com. We're here to support you throughout your journey. I'd love to see you in the bootcamp. No matter what you decide, though, no matter how you proceed next, just know that I am cheering you on all the way. And happy staging.